Hello guys, and welcome back to my channel. So today's tutorial will be on this cowl neck top. So if this is what you'd like to see, please make sure you keep on watching. So for this tutorial, I will begin by drafting a dartless bodice pattern. So first thing I did was to mark 1 inch from the lower part of my pattern paper, and I squared the line across. Now the total top length I used was 21 inches. My actual top length is 20 inches. Plus 1 inch for my hem allowance, that makes it a total of 21 inches. Now from that point, I marked my shoulder line like so, and I squared the line across. And on that line, I'm going to mark half of my shoulder measurement. So 16 divided by 2 is 8. So I marked 8 inches right there. And from that point, I came downwards by 1 inch. That would be for my shoulder slant. Now on this point, I would mark half of my armhole measurement, which is 8 inches. From here, it will be 9 inches. So I squared the 2 points across like this. Now on this line, I would still mark half of my shoulder measurement, which is 8 inches, and I'll connect the line upwards towards my shoulder slant measurements. So this is my bust line, and to get my waistline, from my shoulder line, I would take 17 inches downwards. So my shoulder to waist measurement is 17 inches, and I'm just going to connect the 2 points like this. Then I marked the midpoint of my armhole line, that will be 4 inches. And from that point, I went inwards by 1 inch. So after doing that, I would mark 3 inches on my shoulder line for my neck width and come down by 3 inches for my neck depth. And I will connect the curve like this. So next thing is to create the shoulder slant line, and this was how I did it. So here I have my waistline, and this is my top line. My bust circumference is 38, so a quarter of that is 9.5. So I marked that right here, and then I added half an inch for ease allowance, and then my 1 inch side seam allowance. On my waistline, a quarter of my waist circumference is 8 inches. Plus 1 inch for ease allowance, that is 9, and 1 inch for my side seam allowance, which is 10. So I marked exactly the same thing on my top line, and I'm just going to connect the 3 points together like so. So to create my armhole curve, I marked 1.5 inches above my bust line, and I placed my ruler this way and connected my armhole curve. So the next thing I did was to come downwards from my shoulder line by 5.5 inches. So yours can be 4 inches if you don't want your cowl neck to be too low. So I marked 5.5 inches and connected the lines together. So the next thing I did was to cut through this line here. And then while cutting through my top line, I make sure to give a little bit of curve around that corner so that I don't have the hem looking all straight. And I cut out the rest of the pattern like this. So we're going to be doing a little bit of slash and spread. So I slashed open my bust line like this, making sure that I don't cut out the entire piece. Now I'm going to place it on my pattern paper like this, and I'm going to be spreading open the bust line. So I spread the bust line by 5.5 inches. So just know that the more you spread it, the more your cowl neck will be deeper. So mine was 5.5. And I used my paper tape to hold the pattern in place. Now you're going to make a straight line from this point here all the way to the edge of the paper like this. The next thing to do is to create the front facing. So you see this line right here, you're going to fold it. So make sure you have extra pattern paper that would account for your front facing. So after folding that line like this, I'm making sure that everything is aligned. Okay, now from the armhole area of my bust line, I'm going to go downwards by 2.5 inches. That's going to be for my front facing. So from this point here, I'm going to be cutting out the pattern to create the front facing. So when I get to where the front facing ends, I'm just going to place a little notch right there. I'm going to cut out the rest of the pattern like this. So I'm just going to cut out my extra pattern paper because I don't need them anymore. The next thing to do is that from here where the front facing ends, I'm just going to make a straight connection towards that line that we have right there at the edge of the paper. So that line needs to be as straight as possible. So after creating the line there, what I did was to just cut out the pattern like this, and the front pattern is ready to be transferred to fabric. So the fabric I use for this tutorial is a satin fabric in emerald green, and I have just a yard of it here. So first thing you're going to do is to fold the fabric on a bias. So you're going to place one edge of your fabric over the other edge like this, so as to create a triangle like this. Now the reason for this is so that your fabric can have a little bit of stretch across this grain like this. So the next thing I did was to place my pattern right there at the folded part of the fabric, and I'm going to go ahead to cut it out. After cutting, at this point right here, please place a notch because it is going to help you when it's time to sew in your straps. So after transferring the front pattern to fabric, the next thing to do is to cut out the back. So still using this pattern, I'm going to fold the bust line area like this. So the back doesn't have an armhole. That's the reason why I folded the bust line area inwards, and I'm using my pin to hold the pattern in place. So once that is done, the back pattern is ready to be transferred to fabric. So just like the front, I'm going to fold my fabric on the bias like so, and then I'm going to place my pattern like this on my fabric. So the back does not have a zipper, so make sure that the center back is on a fold. So once I was done cutting, I placed a notch right there at the center back, and from the center back I went inwards by 2.5 inches, and I placed a notch right there. So this is so as to know the position to place the straps at the back. So for my strap, I cut out a piece of fabric that was about 15.5 inches, and the fabric was on a fold, and the width was 1.5 inches. So my fabric was on a fold, and I made 2 pieces for my straps. So what I did was to cut this part open, and remember that the length is 15.5. So to create the straps, I took this to my sewing machine and I folded the piece of fabric into 2, and I'm just going ahead to sew by a 0.25 inch seam allowance. And after sewing, I will be turning the fabric inside out by using this my tool called the loop turner. So I just place it like this, and I'm going to pull my fabric inside out. So after doing that, I have my strap ready. So I'm going to repeat the same process for the second piece of fabric. So I have the 2 straps ready. So for the next step, I will be sewing in the edge of my front facing. So on this edge right here, I'm going to fold my fabric by 1/2 inch, and I'm going to make a straight stitch from here all the way to the other edge. If you have an overlocker, it will be easier for you to just overlock the raw edges instead of sewing it in. So after sewing mine, here's what I have. Now to sew in the straps, remember this place that I asked that you place a notch while cutting on your fabric. That is where the front facing starts from. Now you're going to place your straps, one of your strap rather, you're going to place it right in between the notch there. And from this point, I'll be sewing by 1/2 inch all the way till I get to the armhole area. So I am done sewing, and the next thing to do is to trim off the excess seam allowance around that area, but you can choose to overlock yours if you have an overlocker. So after sewing, it should look like this. So you can go ahead to give this area a good press if you'd like. So on the other side, where I have the notch, I'm essentially going to repeat the same thing. Place the strap in between that notch and then sew all the way to the armhole area by 1/2 inch seam allowance. So after sewing, I'll repeat the same process by trimming off the excess seam allowance around that area. So after sewing, this is what it should look like. Now moving on to the back, remember the notches that I placed at the back of the fabric? So from the center back notch, I went inwards by 2.5 inches. So I'm going to use my chalk so as to make those points prominent. So after doing that, next thing I did was to fold the upper part of the back like this, and I'm going to be sewing with a straight stitch by 1/2 inch all the way till I get to the other edge. So after sewing, you can see that the mark are still there. Now you're going to bring the front like this, and you're going to place the strap right under the 2.5 inch mark away from the center back like so. So I'm going to use my pin to hold the strap underneath that point, and I'm also going to repeat the same thing on the other side. I'm going to straighten up the strap and place it right under that 2.5 inch point, and then I'm going to take this to my sewing machine, and I'm going to make a straight stitch right here and right here. After sewing the straps to the back, I just placed the front and back side seam together like this, and remember that my side seam allowance is 1 inch. So I'm just going ahead to sew the sides by my 1 inch side seam allowance. So after sewing, if you have an overlocker, please overlock the raw edges right there. So I just went ahead to repeat the same thing on the other side. I joined the sides together and I went ahead to sew again by my 1 inch side seam allowance. Again, if you have an overlocker, please don't forget to overlock the raw edges. And here's what the sides look like after sewing. Now the next thing is to sew the hem. So the allowance I added for the hem was 1 inch all round. So to sew the hem, I'm going to be folding it twice like this, and then with a straight stitch, I'm going to start sewing from one side all the way to the other side. So after sewing, I'll go ahead and give the hem a good press so it relaxes very well. So after giving the entire piece a good press, here's the final look. Please, if this video has helped you in any way, please make sure to leave your comment down in the comment section and subscribe to the channel if you haven't.